The Wytch Wood was once alive, a place of breath and bloom. Now it festers, fog clings to bark like memory, and the trees whisper names no one should answer.
G'day guys, and welcome back to the Hobby Hatch. In this episode, I'll take you through how I kitbashed, sculpted, and painted this custom cyborg mini using leftover Warhammer parts, how I built a mutated tree from scratch using just wire and some plastic putty, and how I brought everything together in a detailed riverbank scene, complete with its own flowing epoxy resin river. To get started, this whole idea came from a few sketches I did while fleshing out my occult sci-fi universe, A World To Lament. I imagined sections of old-growth forest, rotted and twisted after years of pollution and occult activity, and from that, the witch trees are born. I began building a thrall of the witch tree, now named Kevin Mortimus, the protector of the Wytch Wood, thanks to some of you on Instagram, and to do this, I dug through my bits box and found an Adeptus Arbites torso, plus some leftover Mechanicus parts. I trimmed and sanded the arms into a good pose and glued them in place, and added an air tank to the back, which I later sculpted some pipes onto using green stuff. For sculpting, I used a 50-50 mix of green stuff and milliput. It gives you a nice balance of flexibility and firmness, perfect for miniature work with this kind of detail. I rolled out some piping, connected it from Kevin's mast to his air tank, and added a few details to really sell the corrupted cyborg look. Once the sculpting was done, it was onto the painting. I primed the model black and gave it a pre-shade with Prussian blue. I then base coated the metal areas with Eschen grey and the leathers with Rhinox hide from Citadel. After everything was base coated, I gave the whole mini a wash of Agrax Earthshade to bring in the details of the recesses. Once that was dry, I began highlighting. I then painted all of the metals in a silver non-metallic metal style, making the bounce highlight brown to match the colour I was going to paint the terrain. I wanted these eye lenses to be ominous, so I painted them in a red object source lighting style, casting some of the light across his armour. With that done, Kevin was complete and it was time to move on to crafting the mutant tree. I started by rolling out a loose bundle of thin gauge wire, which I then twisted together to form the trunk of the tree. I cut the loops at each end of the bundle and began splitting each offshoot and twisting them to form the branches. I recommend wearing gloves for this. The wire spiked me good more than once during the process. Once the shape of the tree was finished, I filled in the wire texture using liquid plastic putty. I then glued down a ball bearing to act as our mutant tree's eye and sculpted eyelids around it using milliput. For the tree bark texture, I used a Grelin Earth technical paint from Citadel. This will crack and chip once it's dry, and it'll give us a nice convincing bark texture in the end. And while that dried, I began building up the terrain with XPS foam. I roughly marked out how I wanted the topography of the diorama, making sure I referenced Kevin's size to get the right scale. I then cut and shaped offcuts to form each side of the riverbank. Once that was finished, I added a plasticard rim to the border of the diorama and filled it with terrain texture paste. In this case, I used dark earth texture from Vallejo. I scraped the paste all the way up to the plasticard edge and smoothed it out with a cheap wet brush. I then glued in the witch tree. You can see the texture paste has done its job, and I'm cracking off a lot of it from all this handling, but once it's in place, I'll add a little more Grelin Earth to areas that were left a little too bare. I then added some smooth pebbles to act as river rocks in the riverbed, and once they're in place, I used various different sizes of texturing gravel to distinguish between the riverbed and the riverbanks. The riverbed being coarser and the banks being finer to try and mimic what you'd see in real life. Then it was onto the painting. I began by spraying Rhinox hide over a black primer coat, and then to differentiate the riverbed, I painted a sickly, desaturated green colour to indicate scum or algae on the bottom. I also sprayed the underside of the tree branches with the same colour to match the tone of the scene. I then darkened the tree using wildwood contrast paint and pushed the green tones in the tree shadows using Plaguebearer contrast paint from Citadel. I then pushed the tree's highlights further by stippling over some light brown. I then went ahead and washed the diorama with a burnt umber oil paint. I tend to find that oil paint dries really matte, and so it's quite useful for building up grittiness at the appropriate scale for this diorama. I then dry brushed the terrain and the tree to reinforce some of the brightness that was lost from the oil wash. Then it was time to paint the eye. For this, I painted the entire ball bearing in off-white. I then used a piece of straw that my brushes were packaged with to protect the bristles and imprinted a red circle outline for the iris. I then painted the iris in with red, and using a small round sculpting tool, I very carefully pressed the pupil on with some black paint. Now I can imagine that tree bark isn't exactly the softest home for an eye, so I laid in some red around the eye to indicate irritation. I then gave the eye some appropriate shininess with some gloss varnish. I then went in with some dirty down rust for the chain details. I found that you get better results and color variation with this kind of product if you activate the paint with a little water before it dries. I used Blood for the Blood God technical paint to finish the grim detail around the eye. Now onto the resin pour. I end up using Mylar plastic sheets for the barrier because they're really cheap, way cheaper than acrylic, and you can get about a 20 sheet pack off Amazon for $16 Australian. So for you American viewers, even cheaper than that. And they're big too, so you won't have to order much more. The purple that you're seeing is actually masking liquid, and it's perfect for sealing in the cracks that the resin will try and escape through. I got this trick off Fantasy Games, and I'll leave a link to the article in the description if you'd like to read about it more. So I think my resin was a little too old because it went completely cloudy when it cured. Thankfully it didn't boil itself and melt the mylar, and the colour actually kind of works for a toxic swamp, so we're pushing forwards. To give the water surface some ripples, I used gloss Mod Podge and an airbrush to blow it around, giving me a realistic surface texture. I then glued Kevin down and added some grass foliage and tufts. One of the last steps was my favourite, and it was to add dirty down moss to almost every surface to give the scene a dingy, overgrown tone. I then painted in some white water around the river rocks to give the indication that the water was breaking over the rocks and the river was flowing from left to right. The last step for this diorama was to add some rust pigment powders around the ground elements. And after that, all that was left was to paint the rim black, and it was on to the Glamour Shots.
Stay calm. Stay calm. Stay calm.
Thanks for watching everyone. If you liked the video or learned a new technique, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more. It helps the channel grow and lets me know what people would like to see in future videos. Also, if you have any questions or comments about the techniques or universe I'm building, leave them in the comment section below. I try to respond to each and every one. Finally, if you'd like to participate in the process, like naming Kevin here, I upload progress pictures to my Instagram, link is in the description. Anyway, as always, thanks for watching, check out one of these videos, and I'll see you in the next one.